In the last 25 years, we've had four major corrections or four major issues in this country. You had the tech bubble in 2000. In 2008, you had the real estate correction. In 2013, the federal government realigned the budget and sequestration. And then in 2020, you had COVID. In each one of these, we learned major lessons. As the tech bubble started to happen, what happened was people were investing and they were excited about companies that weren't making money. We all believed that it was the next best thing and the internet was going to continue and all of the new ideas were good ideas. And so we just blindly followed as a nation, or we blindly followed and ignored the business rules that you need to have as a company. If a company's not making money at some point, it can't keep its doors open. And what you saw was company after company over about 5 years just kept climbing and kept bringing money in, trying to go public. People were getting greedy, people were chasing, so people were not using their common sense on how they were investing, and companies were not using the common sense or basic business fundamentals that you should have to save for a rainy day. So when that actually came to head in 2000, well, there was no safety nets for a lot of these companies. There was no safety net for a lot of investors. There was no safety net for the institutional investors, and some states lost their entire retirement system where they were saving. From 2003 to 2008, everyone was chasing the real estate, spec homes, loan repackaging. Here, the regulation and the bank monitoring for unethical transactions was happening. They were hiding losses by bundling and selling them in larger pieces. Great movie that what was happening at that time was The Big Short. But the key piece to this was, once again, we ignored the business fundamentals and we ignored the pieces you need to understand in the basic business process. In this case, people were getting house loans and they couldn't really afford a car loan or their basic bills, but yet we were letting them as a bank or as a nation buy a much larger asset that they couldn't afford to be in. This was artificially helped by the low interest rates. So people were actually buying up larger assets than they would have been able to afford under normal circumstances. When the fall for the real estate market happened, it affected not just the real estate, but it affected developers, land, banks, all the way through the whole system for everybody that touched the real estate. And once again, just like in the tech bubble, people that were chasing success and chasing the next shiny object did not have the fundamental and the basics in place to protect themselves for the losses. In 2012, after Obamacare was approved, the third major correction was actually a government correction. The people on Capitol Hill could not make a decision on how the budget was going to be released. And they stuck a poison pill basically in the budget that if they couldn't come to consensus on what the federal budget should be, that a term called sequestration would go into law whether voted on or not. So therefore, there was no way to get out of it. So what that created across the federal government was an immediate cut to their budget, and the ripple effect down was for those companies, like I talk about in my book in the R Factor. You need to pay attention to the regulatory issues and the governments and the different agencies that can actually influence your organization. Because in this case, if you hadn't prepared for the government not to pass the budget, or for any of the government regulation that happened from this artificial slashing of the budget, companies disappeared overnight because their contracts were canceled because there was no federal money for it to be paid. And our last major drawdown that we had as a nation, we didn't see coming, and it was COVID. And it shut down the world because we didn't know what to do with this medical pandemic or this major problem with a disease that we didn't understand and didn't know how to control. And so as a nation and a global market, we're trying to figure it out, regulation and influence from government organizations were almost draconian in some places because they were so afraid of what was happening and they didn't know how to get out of the tailspin. So the best way to control it was for them to just cut everything off and then try to unwind it and get it to jumpstart again. What happens every day though is just because you stop something doesn't mean that it can be restarted, because maybe there's not enough fluidity in the structure, especially when you deal with things like just-in-time manufacturing. You can't just stop and start them, because once you shut them down, you have a major issue to restart it. As I've looked at these four issues over the last 2 decades, most of the major downfall was for companies either chasing what they thought was better opportunity and ignoring basic business fundamentals, or not putting stopgaps in place for when there's an emergency. In the tech bubble, as I said, you had a major problem where everybody chased the next thing for success. There was no diversity in the portfolios. People wanted to make their best returns. So therefore they exposed themselves to the most risk with nothing to fall back on. When you look at the real estate, once again, everybody flooded. They ignored a lot of the business principles. And then even in the financial institutions where they've had hundreds of years of banking regulatory issues from the 1930s, from the Great Depression, all of those things were thrown out the window. And they just went after things to bundle it and hide the actual problems. So as you think about this in your business, you need to be asking the 5 W's, right? Why, and why, and get to the root causes of what's going on in your business and how you plan to protect it. Because only you, as the manager, the owner, or the entrepreneur, can protect the business from these drastic downfalls or keep the business solvent when things like this happen. Now that I've talked about the top level or the 50,000 foot view, let's talk about it more granular. What are you doing to look at your product? If something like this happens and you're a product company, how do you look at your product and look at the supply chain for your product? How do these different types of downfalls affect the way that you would handle the crisis management to keep your supplies coming in from your vendors? Have you got alternative supply chains? During COVID, we lost our major supply chain from China because things weren't made in the US. Have you looked at other places than just China for your products? And are there local vendors that can help you with your products? And how do you deal with them? Are you developing relationships with your local community that could help with your product? And then when you look at your processes, what processes do you have to ensure that your manufacturing leads or that your supply chain is protected? What processes do you have in place to make sure your people can adjust? Are you one deep in a company where one pivotal position goes away because they're sick or they die, and now a whole department is in just stalemate because it doesn't know what to do? So as you're looking at these things and you're building your recreation plans or your protection plans for the company, look at not just your product, but look at your process and your people. And across all 3 of them, how would they be affected by another downturn in the economy? What are your recovery methodologies going to be for those things? And I specifically point out regulation, supply chain, vendors, and customers. When you look at the outside sources or the silent partners that you have in your business, you have to think about how they can affect you. Take a deliberate look at how the federal government, not just in taxing, but in regulation, can change the way your companies run. And you don't get a vote, it just happens to you. Take a look at your state and local regulation. What's happening in your local community? Either local taxes, zoning, new fire regulation, whatever it might be. Stay attuned to what's happening in, like I say, the silent partners that get a vote in your company. Take a look at your banking. I recommend always having more than one bank for your business. What have you done in these last 4 economic downturns? What process have you been put in place? What discussions with your people have you had? The relationships that you have as a company through your people to the outside organizations that can affect you have to be done. And you have to prepare, because most companies just hunker down and they just try to work through it to just try to stay alive. My recommendation is going to be to look at your relationships through your people, to look at your market and all the things that affect it. And then that way you can be prepared for the next economic downturn.